The metal door slammed shut with a sound that could freeze the blood in your veins. The echo traveled down the long, dimly lit corridor, bouncing off the cold concrete walls, until it seemed to surround him from every side. Bryan Kohberger stood there, his wrists still red from the cuffs, his eyes darting nervously toward the cell that was about to become his entire world. No cameras, no courtroom, no lawyers, just him, the guards, and the kind of silence that feels alive. The hallway reeked of bleach and sweat, the stale air heavy enough to choke on. Somewhere deep inside the prison, a man was screaming, long, broken wails that rose and fell until they sounded less like a person and more like an animal being slaughtered. Kohberger didn't move. He just listened. Maybe he was wondering what had happened to the man. Maybe he was wondering when it would happen to him. The guard didn't bother with small talk. He didn't say welcome or follow me. He simply gripped Kohberger's arm tighter and walked him toward the solitary wing. Every step echoed in a slow, dreadful rhythm. Clank, 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 until they reached the last steel door. This was no ordinary cell. For inmates like him, high profile, high risk, this was a cage inside a cage. 8 feet long, 6 feet wide, concrete on every side, a slit of a window too high to see through. No bed frame, just a thin mattress that looked like it belonged in a junkyard. The toilet and sink were steel, bolted together like they were afraid even water could be a weapon. The guard slid his tray inside, a dry sandwich and a small carton of milk, and without another word, the door clanged shut. Kohberger stood frozen, his fingers still curled from where the cuffs had bitten into his skin. He looked around slowly, like someone surveying the inside of a coffin. For the first time, he was truly alone. Not just alone in the sense of being without friends or family, but cut off from the world. No sunlight, no sound except his own breathing. Even the air felt like it belonged to someone else. Outside his door, the prison's heartbeat kept thudding on, chains rattling, boots marching, shouts echoing, but inside, time began to dissolve. Minutes stretched into hours. The light never changed. The walls seemed to lean in closer with every breath. Some people say death is the worst punishment a man can face, but death is quick. Death is final. This was different. This was slow, deliberate, and personal, like the prison itself had hands, and it was wrapping them around his mind. And Bryan Kohberger, standing in the middle of his cell on that first night, might have finally realized the truth. In this place, every single day would be darker than death. By dawn, if you could call it that, Bryan Kohberger had already lost track of time. In solitary confinement, there was no sunrise, no horizon, just the same dim artificial light humming overhead, buzzing faintly like a trapped insect. The slit in the wall they called a window was useless. It wasn't for looking out. It was for the guards to look in. The rules of his new life were brutally simple. 23 hours locked inside this concrete box, 1 hour allowed outside, if you could call it outside, in a yard surrounded by razor wire and steel fences, high enough to block even the thought of escape. The door was solid steel with only 2 openings, a narrow food slot at waist level and a reinforced rectangle at eye level. Both could be slammed shut in an instant. Through those slits, he would receive everything: meals, medication, orders. It was the only point of contact between him and the rest of the prison. When the guards delivered breakfast, they didn't speak. They didn't need to. The tray slid through the slot, the sound of metal scraping against metal, and then, clang, the slot slammed shut again. 2 boiled eggs, a slice of bread, weak coffee in a paper cup. It wasn't meant to nourish him. It was meant to remind him he was dependent on them for everything. The walls were painted in a sickly off-white, chipped in places, revealing darker stains beneath, stains that might have been from water, or maybe from something else. The floor was bare concrete, cold enough to numb bare feet. The mattress on the floor was so thin, He could feel the hardness beneath when he lay down. Even the blanket smelled faintly of bleach and something metallic. Kohberger tried to keep his mind busy. He counted the bricks on one wall. He recited numbers in his head. He thought about cases he had studied, conversations he had overheard, and the trial that awaited him. But no matter what he thought about, the silence always came back. And in prison, silence doesn't feel peaceful. It feels alive, like it's watching you. The guards kept him here for his own safety. But safety was a relative term. It wasn't about protecting him from the prison. It was about protecting the prison from him being killed before the state decided his fate. High-profile inmates are targets. A murder suspect like Bryan Kohberger, accused of crimes that had sickened the public, was worth a lot in prison currency. Killing him would be a way for another inmate to make a name, to become a legend in this violent ecosystem. On his second day, he was allowed into the yard. It was nothing more than a chain-link cage on all sides, the top covered with crisscrossing wire. The ground was concrete, not grass, and the sky was sliced into pieces by the fencing above. No one else was there, just him and the sound of his own footsteps bouncing off the walls. 1 hour later, the guard returned, and without a word, walked him back to the same concrete box. The sound of the door slamming shut was heavier this time, like the building itself was swallowing him whole. It was in those moments, after the food slot closed, after the boots marched away down the hall, that he felt it most. The realization that this wasn't temporary. This was his life now. 23 hours a day in the cage. 1 hour to breathe air that didn't smell recycled. Then back inside. Again and again. Until days and nights no longer meant anything, and time itself felt like it was rotting. And somewhere deep inside, he had to wonder, how long before the walls stopped closing in and simply became part of him? The first real sign that Bryan Kohberger wasn't just alone in this prison, but surrounded, came on his third day. It started as a whisper, faint at first, like the hum of the light above him, impossible to catch every word. But it grew louder. Male voices, low and taunting, drifting through the cracks and steel vents of the solitary wing. "Hey, Kohberger," one voice drawled, stretching the syllables like a knife slowly being pulled from its sheath. Another chimed in, harsher, with a laugh that didn't sound human. "We know who you are." It wasn't just a greeting, it was a warning. High-profile inmates like him don't walk into prison anonymously. Even if they're in solitary, word spreads faster than fire. Newspapers, television, social media, all of it seeps through the cracks in the walls. Guards talk. Prison gossip travels on the air like smoke. In the eyes of the prison population, Bryan Kohberger wasn't just another man. He was a symbol of something vile, something monstrous. And that made him valuable, in the most dangerous way possible. For some inmates, killing him would be the ultimate trophy, the kind of act that could earn them protection, respect, or even fear for the rest of their sentence. Others didn't need a reason beyond revenge for victims they never knew, for crimes they never witnessed, but which still burned in the headlines. From his cell, Kohberger could hear the footsteps of men he would never see. Heavy boots passing outside, slower than the guards, almost like they were pacing, testing the walls, feeling for weaknesses. The guards, to their credit, kept him alive. But their motives weren't compassion. They were duty. If something happened to him before trial, it would be a political disaster, a public scandal. And so, he was locked away, every move monitored. Still, that didn't stop the threats from seeping through. One afternoon, while eating the kind of tasteless lunch only prison could produce, he heard a sound from the other side of the wall. 3 loud knocks. Then silence. Then a voice, deep and ragged. "Don't worry, we'll get you." It wasn't a joke. The tone carried weight, the kind that makes your stomach twist. In prison, threats are currency, and once they're made, they don't vanish. They linger, waiting for the right moment to be cashed in. There were also the guards who didn't hide their disdain. Some gave him longer, colder stares than necessary. Others tightened the cuffs just enough to leave marks. Nothing overt, nothing that would make it into a report, but enough to remind him he had no friends here. He began to eat quickly, keeping his back against the wall so no one could sneak up on him during the rare moments he was escorted outside the cell. Even in the fenced-in yard, he found himself glancing upward at the razor wire, half expecting someone to drop down from it. He had entered a place where enemies didn't need to be in the same room to get to you. And even though the prison claimed he was protected by solitary confinement, the truth was clear. Every day here was a countdown to the moment someone decided to test just how much protection that steel door could give. And in the back of his mind, he knew something else. In a place like this, it's not if someone will try, it's when. By the second week, Bryan Kohberger had stopped trying to keep track of days. At first, he'd scratched small marks into the concrete wall with his fingernail, one line for each day he survived. But the lines began to blur, not because the concrete was too hard, but because time itself had lost its edges. Morning and night felt the same. Meals came and went like clockwork, but in between, there was nothing. Just the hum of the light above him and the weight of the air pressing against his skin. Isolation doesn't just keep you away from other people, it keeps you away from yourself. It strips away the sounds, the smells, the faces, the casual reminders that you exist in a world with meaning. Without them, the mind begins to wander, and then it begins to break. The guards said he barely spoke. Some nights, they'd find him sitting on the edge of the mattress, elbows on his knees, staring at the floor for hours, unmoving. Other times, they'd hear him pacing, slow, deliberate steps, over and over, until the sound became maddening. He developed small rituals, counting his steps from the toilet to the wall, touching the corners of the cell in a precise order before lying down, arranging his food on the tray in perfect symmetry before eating. The yard, his 1 hour of freedom, stopped feeling like a break. It became another prison, just with colder air. Some days, he'd walk in slow circles, his eyes fixed on the ground. Other days, he'd stand completely still, staring up at the mesh overhead, as if trying to remember what the sky really looked like. Then came the paranoia. He began to believe that even inside this concrete box, he wasn't alone, that someone, somewhere, was watching him in ways beyond the obvious cameras. He'd glance over his shoulder when drinking from the sink. He'd pause mid-bite during a meal, listening for whispers. And sometimes, he did hear them. Voices, low, distant, unintelligible, floating through the vents. He couldn't tell if they were real, if other inmates were actually speaking, or if his mind had started generating its own company. The guards noticed changes, too. His eating became erratic. Some days he devoured every crumb, other days he barely touched the food. His eyes, once sharp and calculating in court appearances, had a dullness now, as if he were looking past whatever was in front of him. Sleep offered no escape. Nights brought vivid dreams, some of them replaying the crimes he'd been accused of, others entirely fabricated horrors. In one, he was running down a hallway that never ended, chased by footsteps that were always just behind him. In another, he was lying in a coffin, hearing dirt hit the lid above him. In solitary, there's no one to tell you what's real and what isn't, and without that anchor, even the strongest minds can drift into dangerous waters. For Kohberger, the line between reality and hallucination had begun to blur. The prison didn't have to beat him, starve him, or physically torture him. It just had to wait. Every hour in that cell was another drop of water wearing down stone. And the most terrifying part? The process was slow enough that he could feel himself unraveling, piece by piece, yet powerless to stop it. By now, Bryan Kohberger understood the truth. Prison wasn't a place you served time. It was a place where time served you. slowly, relentlessly, without mercy. The calendar in his head had stopped turning. Weeks blurred into one another, his memories melting into a single, colorless stretch of existence. Some days, he woke with a start, convinced he'd slept through his trial. Other days, he was certain the trial had already happened, that he'd been sentenced, and this concrete box was his forever home. His future wasn't written in years or months. It was written in the echo of boots on the hallway floor, in the sound of the food slot slamming shut, in the monotonous throb of fluorescent light above him. Guards came and went, each one a reminder that the world outside still existed, but only for other people. Sometimes they'd glance at him with the detached pity reserved for the condemned. Other times, their eyes carried something colder, an unspoken thought. You're already dead, and you don't even know it. Every so often, a lawyer's visit or a brief transfer to another holding room would break the monotony. But even these moments were hollow. They weren't freedom. They were simply another cage, painted in a different shade of gray. Inmates who had been in solitary for years often said the same thing. The hardest part wasn't the silence or the confinement or the endless repetition. It was the knowledge that tomorrow would be exactly the same as today. No escape, no variation, no chance of change. Kohberger was starting to understand this in his bones. He could feel it every time he woke up and realized nothing around him had shifted. Not the smell, not the temperature, not the view. In a strange way, death had begun to seem merciful by comparison, because death, at least, had an ending. But here, the sentence wasn't death. It was a living purgatory, a place where he would be kept breathing long enough to feel every second of his own undoing. He wasn't being punished with pain. He was being punished with time. Some nights, when the hallway was quiet and the only sound was the faint hum of electricity in the walls, he'd stare at the ceiling and try to imagine what freedom even felt like. The warmth of the sun, the chaos of a street, the feel of grass underfoot. But the memories were slipping, fading like old photographs left out in the rain. And in the darker moments, when sleep wouldn't come and the cell felt smaller than ever, he'd wonder if this was the plan all along. Not just to lock him away from society, but to erase him from himself. No one knew how long he would be here before his trial, or what his ultimate fate would be. But deep down, he suspected it didn't matter. Whatever the court decided, the prison had already sentenced him. In the eyes of the system, Bryan Kohberger was a man breathing on borrowed air, and somewhere, in the cold silence of his cell, he realized that death wasn't the ultimate punishment after all. This was.